So welcome everyone to today's CPC Connecting Generations webinar. Our speaker today is Krista Westrick-Payne, who is Assistant Director of the National Centre for Family and Marriage Research at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. Krista also works with the Henry County Health Department on community health and population data initiatives, and her research bridges social psychology, family demography and applied public health, focusing on the collection, archiving and visualization of contextual data on marriage, divorce and family well-being in the United States. Today she'll be presenting on the context of connection, linking partnership, place and population data, which examines how institutional, cultural and policy contexts shape marriage and divorce in the United States. So I'll hand over to Krista now to get started.
All right, well, thank you all so much for having me today. I just wanted to say when I started putting this talk together, I realized it was the first time I'd actually really tried to pull all the different strands of my work into one story. And that turned out to be a little trickier than I expected, but mostly because my career hasn't really been what you call a traditional academic path. But with that being said, I'm just going to jump right in. So in keeping with my theme of context, I'm going to start just by showing you where I'm from. Quite literally, I'm joining you from Northwest Ohio, about 2 hours south of Detroit and 4 hours east of Chicago. And that's where I assistant direct research at the National Center for Family and Marriage Research, most often from my home office, 1 mile outside a little village called New Bavaria. Much of my work asks how place shapes families, or in public health language, how the environments where we live, work, and play influence our lives. The public health department I work for is in the same county in which I live, Henry County, which has a population of about 27,000 people. And 92% of our land area in Henry County is agricultural. And although I've lived in Maine, Indiana, and Illinois, where I live right now is where I grew up. My house is actually next door to my parents, and my children are the 5th generation of my dad's family to live on the exact same road. When I began my collegiate education, I started out in art and psychology, and that foundation still very much shapes how I think about human behavior and the interplay between individual choices and structural conditions. Here is my personal adult demographic timeline, and it includes my educational attainment, my employer career trajectory, marriage, migration, childbearing, all those things us family demographers just love to examine. My foray into understanding the effects of place really began with my dissertation work, which looked at marital timing and earnings through an ecological lens. Over time, my questions have expanded beyond economic well-being to include physical and mental health and different aspects of social context. So now I see myself as working at that intersection of family demography and public health, studying contextual determinants of health and developing measures like the Structural Heterosexism Index, which I'll talk about later in the talk, all while continuing my local level marriage and divorce archiving work, as well as the writing, publication, and dissemination of the descriptive statistics on US families in the family profiles that the NCFMR has become known for. And then just briefly, this work was supported by the NICHD and NIMHD under multiple grants, along with our research centers and local partners at BGSU, the County Health Department, and the state of Ohio. So one thing you will notice straight away is that all of my work is based on or in the United States, and my talk is going to be centered on the US. Reviewers and others have asked why I don't do cross-national comparative work, and that is a fair question. But honestly, I view measuring marriage and divorce in the United States in itself a kind of comparative project. We have 50 different systems, and often more if you count counties, each collecting data differently, all governed by distinct laws and norms. So for me, I feel that before I can look outward, I need to understand what's happening here. And the complexity of our own patchwork can tell us a lot about how institutions, policy, and culture shape family life, and how those forces vary from place to place within our own borders. And that diversity, that patchwork, serves as a reminder to me of how easy it is to forget the lens we're seeing through. So the night I was invited to give this talk, my family happened to be all home for dinner, and that's a rare event these days with our eldest child off to college. But when I told them that I'd be speaking to all of you and that St. Andrews was in Scotland, my youngest, she's 11, asked, will everyone there have an accent? And I laughed and I said, honey, I'm the one who's going to have an accent. And it was in that moment that I was reminded of how easy it is to forget the cultural lenses we bring, even to something as seemingly universal as family. We all have families, but no two look the same. And my work really tries to make the familiar strange again, to unsettle the idea that there's one right way to do family, and to show how context gives those meanings their shape. So here's where we're headed today. I'm going to start by grounding us in how I think about context through the theory of conjunctural action. Then I'm going to trace how laws and institutions shape the data we use, look at the patterns those data reveal, and then finally return to the role of policy, place, and crises, especially during COVID-19. With the through line being that we want to see how context shapes what we recognize as family. The theory of conjunctural action, or TCA, offers a way for social demographers to think about family variation and change in relation to the broader structures that shape people's lives. And what I find most useful about TCA is its interdisciplinary foundation. It pulls from psychology, sociology, anthropology, and cognitive science to help us understand not just what people do, but why they act within certain limits. At its core, TCA argues that events like marriage, childbearing, or divorce are not isolated decisions. They're social actions that happen within overlapping structures. And these structures come in two forms. The first is a schematic structure, or the taken for granted ideas and cultural norms that help people interpret the world. And then there's material structures, and these are the tangible institutions, resources, and constraints that can make certain choices possible or impossible. And it's when these forces intersect that the theory calls, those places are called conjunctures. They create the horizon of possibilities for individual action. That's where demographic behavior actually takes shape. And much of my work asks what these conjunctures look like in practice and how schematic and material conditions combine to shape marriage and divorce patterns across place. So one of the things that I find most powerful about the TCA is that it doesn't see people as simply responding to structure. It reminds us that our actions also reshape those structures. Johnson Hanks and colleagues use a wonderful metaphor to describe this process. And I'm quoting them here. It's the creek pushing the bank slightly to the north, even as it deepens the channel. And I really love this image because it captures how change unfolds. It unfolds slowly, cumulatively, through everyday action. The same flow that reinforces the channel can, over time, also alter its course. So in demographic terms, that means we can't just study individuals or outcomes in isolation. We have to look at the conjunctures, the local contexts, and the structures that both constrain and evolve through people's behavior. All right, so now that I've provided a broad framework for how I see different structures shaping action, I want to turn to some of the institutions in the United States that codify those ideas. So to help us understand how beliefs about family became embedded in the systems that we still use today to measure and discuss families. So to connect theory to practice, I want to start by showing you how laws operate as part of the institutional structure shaping family life in the US. So under the TCA, structures aren't abstract. They're embodied in the policies and systems that guide both behavior and data collection. In the US, marriage and divorce laws are mostly governed at the state level, and they vary sometimes quite dramatically across states. Everything from waiting periods to age of consent to residency requirements to obtain a divorce. These differences don't just affect behavior, they affect what gets recorded as well, and ultimately what we can see in the data. At the national level, changes in federal rulings, like those on interracial and same-sex marriage, have literally reshaped who the law recognizes as a married couple. So when we study family demography, we're not just studying people, we're studying systems. Legal shifts like these alter the channel, to borrow from that earlier creek metaphor, by changing both lived experience and the institutional record. I'm going to start with a state level example from Kentucky and then move to a national level example to show how these structural shifts filter into what we are able to count as marriage and divorce. So Kentucky provides a great example of how state level legal changes ripple through both behavior and, in this case, administrative data. In 2018, it became the first state to establish a legal presumption of joint custody and equal parenting time in divorce cases. Essentially, there were a group of fathers who were divorced. They referred to themselves as Disneyland dads, and they wanted the presumption at the time of divorce to be more equally divided between men and women. And that's really what spurred a lot of these changes. There was never, from my understanding, an intent to actually change the divorce law or change the trends of divorce in the state of Kentucky. These fathers just wanted more rights at the beginning of that process. So what's striking, though, is what happened. The refined divorce rate in Kentucky following this law change dropped by 22%. So before the policy went into effect, their refined divorce rate was 17.8. They were in the upper quartile of all states that report to our federal system. It dropped to 13.9, putting them now into just squeaking into the second quartile among all the states. And nationwide, divorce had also dropped, but it didn't drop as quickly. It dropped 18% across the same time period. Now, these data I analyzed for the Wall Street Journal. They're the ones who, they did a huge story on this. It gained a lot of attention nationally. I was on NPR. I had lots of emails and phone calls about it, asking me questions. But while these patterns don't provide an explicit test of the effects of the policy change, it does introduce the possibility that policy might alter not just how child custody decisions are made, but the incidence of marriage dissolution. And then this also turned into a bit of a teaching moment, because when the numbers came out, a lot of people, journalists, content creators, and folks with PhDs and everything from law to psychology were puzzled about why my calculations didn't line up with the federal numbers. And that's because the National Center for Health Statistics reports crude divorce rates, which include everyone, even children and the unmarried in the denominator. So to focus on what's actually happening among married adults, I recalculated those refined divorce rates using NCHS counts and census estimates to get the refined rates. So Kentucky's reform shows how family law often changes from the ground up, and same-sex marriage followed a similar path, beginning in a few states before reaching federal recognition in the Supreme Court ruling of Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015. For over a decade, legal recognition depended entirely on geography. A couple could be a legally defined family with inheritance and hospital visitation rights in one state, and then legally unrelated roommates in the next. Divorce was even trickier. Many couples married outside their home states and later found that they couldn't divorce without first establishing residency where their marriage was recognized. And those rules varied dramatically across the US, revealing just how fragmented the legal landscape was. The key takeaway here is that our administrative and survey systems weren't built for this kind of fluid legality. Even as the law changed, many data systems didn't, reminding us that institutional reform and measurement rarely move at the same pace. So while laws define who can marry or divorce, data define who we can actually count. And to really understand the inconsistencies we see today in the US, we have to look backward because our data systems themselves grew in fits and starts. So I'm going to use county level administrative counts of marriages and divorces as an example. It's what I know the most about in this area. And this timeline shows when these particular measures were available and who was in charge of collecting those data, which actually didn't start until right after the Civil War, almost a century after the US was founded. So in the early decades, marriage and divorces were recorded only sporadically. They were collected by the Commissioner of Labor and then by the Census Bureau. Some years, divorce was measured and marriage wasn't. And these efforts were discontinuous, different agencies, different priorities, and clearly big gaps in between. So our marriage and divorce data infrastructure was patchwork from the start, reflecting shifts in institutions as much as shifts in families. But those shifts didn't stop there. Following the end of World War II, federal coordination actually ramped up for a while in the 1950s, but it didn't last. Detailed administrative data collection was suspended in 1996, leaving a gap that our team at the NCFMR has spent the last 15 years working to rebuild. So we've reconstructed historical county level data from 1867 through 2019. We standardized and geocoded those data so that they can now be linked with other contextual measures and they can be attached to other data sets. In 2023, we released the first county level counts that include same-sex couples, something never before publicly available. And by 2026, we'll again have monthly state level marriage and divorce counts, something the US hasn't had in decades. So when we look across this timeline, what we see isn't just a data story, it's an institutional one. The fragmentation of our administrative data mirrors the fragmentation of how marriage and divorce themselves are governed in the US. So when we talk about fragmentation, it's not just about who collects the data or when, but it's also what's on the form itself. And the forms, when it comes to administrative data, are very important because that's the data that the NCFMR that we archive comes from. So unlike death certificates in the US, which follow a standardized national electronic template, marriage and divorce forms are entirely state-based. There's no single format for how a couple's sex or gender composition is recorded. So these 5 states that are in the darker shades of orange here, Alaska, Michigan, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and West Virginia, are currently the only ones reporting data that can identify divorces between couples of the same sex. But even among those 5, the forms themselves are all completely different. And those differences aren't trivial. They show how politically fragile measurement can be. A recent executive order told federal agencies to replace the word gender with sex and to scrub any mention of gender ideology from official documents. So in the US, what we can even name in the data is being shaped by politics, not just methods. Maps like this aren't only about geography, they're about institutional power, the way policies, language, and laws shape what we can count. Even our forms carry the imprint of those structures. And that's really the landscape my work sits within, where the technical, the political, and the structural converge. When we analyze marriage and divorce today, we're really reading the history of our institutions line by line and form by form. Now, so far, I've focused a lot on the fragmentation and of our system and how it shows up in our administrative data. From laws to agency history and the forms and categories we can ascertain from those systems. That same story, though, is also visible in our national surveys, including the American Community Survey. The ACS is the largest continuous household survey in the US, sampling about 1% of all households each year since it was fully implemented in 2005. And it's how we track household composition, living arrangements, and marital patterns. And it's part of the Census Bureau's legally mandated counts for the United States. In 2019, the Census Bureau implemented the first major relationship to householder redesign in over a decade. And that change finally allowed us to directly identify same and different sex couples, a big step forward for measurement quality, and notably, it arrived 4 years after federal marriage recognition in 2015. The first full 5-year file reflecting that redesign covers the years 2019 through 2023. So the 2023 release is the first time those revised categories are fully represented across the 5-year ACS. the sample large enough to produce reliable estimates for smaller populations like same-sex couples, and for smaller geographies like counties, census blocks, and tracts where much of the law in the United States actually takes place. But limits still remain. The ACS records where people live now, not where a marriage or divorce occurred, which makes linking survey responses to state-level policies very difficult. The ACS is collected on a rolling basis, meaning the reference period for the married or divorced in the past 12 months questions can stretch nearly 2 years. And importantly, those last year marriage and divorce counts are not available at the county level, even in our 5-year files. So while the ACS gives us consistent state and national estimates, it can't deliver the local or monthly precision that administrative counts can. And that's why the NCFMR's reconstructed county data and forthcoming monthly state level counts are so valuable. They're the only consistent source of local level incident rates that can be paired with contextual data. So in short, the 2019 ACS redesign improved visibility, but measurement is never neutral. It's shaped by timing, question wording, and collection design. And as we zoom out across counties and states, we can see how these institutional differences translate into real demographic patterns where people are marrying and divorcing and how those patterns shift over time. All right, now that I've given you all a brief primer on the collection of marriage and divorce data in the US, I'm sure more information than you ever really wanted to know. I'm going to turn your attention next to some of the long-term national patterns. And these are a lot of the things that the Marriage Center has become known for publishing. And I'm going to talk about what those patterns reveal about institutional change. So at the national level, changes in marriage reflect long-term institutional and behavioral shifts. And this chart shows how the US marriage rates have changed since 1970, using both refined and crude measures. The refined rate, shown by the darker line at the top, counts marriages among those at risk of marrying, adults aged 15 and older who are not currently married. And it has fallen from 76.5 in 1970 to 31.2 in 2024, a decline of about 59%. The crude rate, shown in the lighter line at the bottom, includes the total population as the denominator. Now, this has also dropped, but this has only dropped by 43%, from 10.6 in 1970 to 6.1 in 2024. And that difference really matters. The crude rate can mask part of the behavioral change by masking compositional changes in the US population because it includes people who cannot marry, while the refined rate better captures the real shifts in marriage formation. Taken together, though, both measures show that marriage in the US has declined sharply over the past 5 decades, reflecting not just personal choices, but broader social and institutional change. The decline in marriage isn't just about individual behavior, it's about how institutions, policies, and economic conditions shape the timing and meaning of marriage itself. And when we look at divorce, we're going to see those same institutional forces at work producing a long-term decline that runs counter to some cultural expectations. So this figure here shows both refined and crude divorce rates from 1970 to 2023. The refined rate, again, shown by the darker line on top, captures divorces per 1,000 married women, focusing only on those at risk of divorcing. Now, in the US, that peaked in 1979 at 22.8 and has since essentially declined to 14.2 in 2024, which is a decline of about 38%. Now, the crude rate, shown in that orange line on the bottom, represents divorces per 1,000 people in the total population. This has dropped even more, down 58%, from 5.3 in 1979 to 2.4 in 2023. So while popular wisdom still claims divorce continues to increase in the United States, a sentiment I'm asked about a lot when journalists call, the divorce rate indicates its incidence is actually decreasing. Popular wisdom in the US also claims that half of all marriages end in divorce, but the data tell a more nuanced story. Based on measures from the Survey of Income and Program Participation, the SIP, another source of federal survey data, approaching 40% of first marriages ended in divorce in 2023. But this varies by how long you've been married. So taken together, both trends show that divorce in the US has been steadily declining for decades, even as cultural narratives about divorce have lagged behind. Further, these trends mask sociodemographic variation. One area I've spent considerable time on is understanding differences in family formation among sexual minority populations and looking at how they compare to heterosexual and cisgender populations. What we can estimate, though, is limited by the structural systems I've already described. But even when the data are challenging or imperfect, it's still worth the effort to measure, to identify gaps, and to advocate for improvement. These figures are examples of how marriage and divorce patterns differ by couple type and how fragmented our measurement systems remain. So on the left, we've combined data from the American Community Survey for our numerator and the Household Pulse Survey, which is also administered by the Census Bureau and has now been renamed, for our denominator to estimate refined marriage rates by sex and sexual orientation. What stands out is the biological sex pattern. Lesbian women marry at rates similar to straight women, about 48 per 1,000, while gay men marry at much lower rates, around 18 per 1,000. On the right, we shift from survey to administrative data for our numerators to estimate divorce rates. These data come from the only 5 states that record couple sex or gender on divorce certificates, those 5 states I mentioned before and showed that map with all those different forms. Across these states, the refined divorce rate for same-sex couples is about 29 per 1,000 compared to about 17 per 1,000 overall. So even though we now have marriage equality, we still don't have data equality. No single national system yet allows us to study both marriage and divorce by couple sex or sexual orientation or gender identity. We had to bridge 2 different data infrastructures and 3 sources to make these comparisons possible. To dig deeper, I'm next going to focus on 3 states where the underlying records were detailed enough to estimate sex-specific divorce rates. So these 3 states, Michigan, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, allowed me to do this. So while I didn't mention it at the time, on that last slide, I had restricted rates by specific years since marriages were formed. Now recall, timing isn't trivial. The risk of divorce changes throughout the duration of a marriage, and the unequal access to marriage in the US further complicates producing comparable estimates across couple type. Further, we don't know from administrative data when the marriages that ended in divorce actually began. So to attempt to address these inconsistencies, I tried to align rates with major legal milestones in the US. So that's why I used, so for 2004, that's when Massachusetts became the first state to legalize same-sex marriage. 2013, after United States versus Windsor, which expanded federal recognition and triggered a surge in marriages. And then 2015, after Obergefell and Hodges, when marriage equality was recognized nationwide. Across all these versions, divorce rates for same-sex couples remain higher than those for all couples, around 27 per 1,000 compared to 17 per 1,000 overall. And again, these are slightly different from the ones before because these are just restricted to those 3 states. And when we break those down by sex, we see a familiar pattern. Female couples have the highest rates, around 35 per 1,000, while male couples are closer to 15. These patterns mirror what we saw in the marriage rates, where female couples had higher rates of marriage, and they highlight how staggered policy timelines and inconsistent data systems complicate even basic estimation of incidence rates. Now, this slide puts the policy landscape and behavior into direct conversation. So on the left, you can see how uneven the rollout of same-sex marriage was leading up to 2015. Each state here is shaded by the number of years couples had access to legal marriage by the time of the Obergefell decision. So for more than a decade, only a handful of states, again, Massachusetts being the first, had legal recognition. Meanwhile, 88% of the country had 5 years or less of access, and about 30% had no access at all until Obergefell went into effect. On the right, we can see how that uneven policy history shows up in people's reports of when they married. So this figure uses data again from the American Community Survey and focuses on same-sex married couples living in those 5 states that we had talked about, that we can link administrative and survey records together. And what stands out is the timing pattern. We see small but steady reports of same-sex marriages through the early 2000s. They're all in the yellow, followed by a sharp rise after United States versus Windsor in 2013, and another surge following Obergefell and Hodges in 2015. But here's the striking part. Nearly half, all right, about 47% of same-sex couples in the ACS reported that they married before 2004, when same-sex marriage wasn't yet legal anywhere in the United States. So these are all self-reports. These are not legal records. And many of those couples likely formalized their unions through commitment ceremonies, religious services, or local domestic partnership registries, and later responded to survey questions that they were marriages, because to them, they were. Also, not evident in this slide is the history of data, quote unquote, cleaning done by the census and how these practices have changed over time and what that might mean for our estimates. The broader point is that our measures of marriage reflect not just behavior, but availability, the opportunity to legally marry, and the language available to describe that relationship. So when we talk about a start date for same-sex marriage, it's not a single point in time. Both the law and lived reality evolved unevenly across states and across years. That's why when we interpret these data, we have to think about access and recognition together, what was legally possible and what was statistically visible. All right, so far we've looked at marriage and divorce rates, essentially the macro trends of formation and dissolution. But another important shift is when and how people form unions in the first place. As shown here on the left, the median age at first marriage in the US has climbed dramatically over the past 40 years, from the early 20s in the 1980s to now the late 20s and early 30s today. And that rise has been consistent across most groups, though there are some educational and racial differences. However, marriage isn't the only way people form unions. When we add cohabitation, as in the figure on the right, the picture changes. The age at first union, that is the age people first enter a co-residential partnership, has stayed remarkably stable over time. What's changed most is the sequencing of relationships. Cohabitation has replaced early marriage as the first union type in the US, rising from about 46% of first marriages in the 1980s to roughly 80% today. For many heterosexual couples, that shift reflects changing norms. But for same-sex couples, cohabitation wasn't just a choice. It was, until recently, the only legally available option. So people aren't delaying intimacy or commitment, they're delaying formalization. Marriage has become less of an entry point into adulthood and more of a culmination of it. And that helps explain both the later ages at first marriage and declining rates overall. And it reminds us that medians can hide a lot of variation, especially among same-sex couples whose timing and pathways into marriage remain uniquely shaped by access and recognition. When we look at recent newlyweds, the age differences between same-sex and different-sex couples become clear. On average, same-sex couples marry later than their different-sex counterparts. For first-time newlyweds, the mean age at first marriage is 32 for women in same-sex couples compared to 29 for women in different-sex couples. Among men, it's 38 versus 31. These gaps suggest that even with full legal access, marriage is often entered into later in life for same-sex couples, sometimes following long-term cohabitation or previous legal partnerships. Interestingly, among remarried couples, these differences disappear. Same-sex and different-sex couples who are remarrying show nearly identical average ages. So the age gap we see in first marriages reflects when and how couples gained access, not differences in desire or commitment, but in opportunity and timing. All right, so far, I've shown you how the timing and meaning of union formation has changed for adults in the US. But what's particularly interesting is how those shifts are reflected among younger cohorts. So this figure shows high school seniors' expectations for marriage and children between 2019 and 2022. The orange line represents, the line at the top, represents students who expect both marriage and children, what we refer to as the traditional family trajectory. You can see that's declined notably over just 3 years, from about 69% to 61% among boys and 66 to 59% among girls. Meanwhile, the brown line, that's the center line there, those represent students who were uncertain or had mixed expectations. And what we see here is that's rising. That group grew to over 1/3 of all high school seniors by 2022. So even before reaching adulthood, we're already seeing growing ambivalence about traditional marriage and childbearing, the same patterns that are reshaping adult family formation. If we take a step back and look at the full picture so far, 3 patterns emerge. First, marriage and divorce rates are declining. The structural participation in these institutions is shrinking. Second, we're seeing delayed unions. People still form partnerships, but marriage now comes later, after education, employment, and other adult milestones. And third, uncertainty is rising, especially among younger cohorts who increasingly see marriage and parenthood as conditional rather than assumed. Together, these shifts redefine marriage as an achievement rather than a given, a capstone rather than a starting point. It's not that family formation has disappeared, but it's more negotiated now and possibly more contingent on context, which brings us to the next question. How do these patterns vary spatially across the country? So far we've talked about when and how people form unions, the macro level shifts in timing and meaning, but those choices don't unfold in a vacuum. They're patterned by the systems people live within, the legal, economic, and institutional conditions that make some family forms easier to enter or sustain than others. In this next section of the talk, I'm going to focus on not just policy, but policy will be one of them, as context, how specific systems, shocks, and structures shape family formation. And I'm going to share 4 examples from my work over the past 10 years that illustrate these ideas. I'm going to start with some county level correlates that reveal how economic, religious, and political environment shape marriage and divorce. Then we're going to take a look at structural heterosexism and migration, showing how institutional inequality channels where people choose to live and form families. Then we'll move on to COVID-19 as a policy shock, illustrating how crises amplify existing vulnerabilities. And then we're going to round it all out, and I'm going to talk about my work on religious paradox or political divide, which looks at how 2 of our most enduring institutions in the United States, religion and politics or law, intersect to shape the 3rd enduring institution, the family. So let's start at the county level, at that intersection of geography, inequality, and family life. This analysis looks at how local economic, political, and religious conditions correlated with marriage and divorce rates across more than 3,000 US counties. These data are from 2010, but similar patterns are evident in more recent data years. And you can see here that 2 of the same factors that predicted high marriage rates, when I say high, I'm always referring to marriage rates that fall in that top quartile of all rates, the same with the divorce rates. Higher shares of evangelical Protestant adherence and political conservatism or voting for Republican presidential candidate. These were also associated with higher divorce rates. In other words, the various systems that promote early or frequent marriage in the US can also make those marriages more fragile. By contrast, counties with higher shares of Democratic voters and Catholic adherents tend to have both lower marriage and lower divorce rates, a kind of what I refer to as selective marriage pattern, where marriage becomes more deliberate and delayed. And beyond what's shown here, several factors were linked to only one outcome. For example, higher education and income were negatively correlated with divorce, but weren't associated with marriage. Likewise, inequality, measured with the Gini coefficient, housing density, rent, and crime rates were all positively correlated with divorce. Taken together, these patterns reinforce that marriage and divorce share some structural roots, but also respond differently to economic and social context. So that descriptive project got me thinking about different possible clusters of marriage and divorce behavior across counties in the US. And I wanted to know if family behaviors were spatially organized and if this organization may have shifted over time. And we might think of this as a geography of family systems. The overarching idea is that if marriage and divorce are distributed unevenly across the landscape, this could be an indication of broader social and economic divides. Now here I operationalize ideas or areas with low marriage and low divorce rates as places, again, with more selective marital patterns, and they're in the light purple. Those with high marriage rates and low divorce rates, I term areas with traditional marriage patterns, denoted in the tan color. The phrase, quote unquote, barriers to marriage, I reserve for places with very low marriage and very high divorce rates. And then finally, the fourth constellation that I have were areas with high marriage and high divorce, and I referred to those as concentration of risk, and those are in the black, the darkest. Interestingly, the share of counties that fell into these different classifications did not vary a whole lot from 2000 to 2019. I've got those in that little table on there. But where those counties were did change. So what we see is a shift, particularly among counties with high marriage and high divorce rates from the US, what we refer to here as the Bible Belt in the South, to the West. But while these patterns reflect broad social systems, not everyone experiences those systems equally. Access to marriage and family itself remains structured by inequality. And that becomes even clearer when we look at institutional environments shaped by law and policy, which moves to our next project. So the previous slide showed some clusters of marital patterns at the county level. Here, I'm going to zoom out a little bit to look at how institutional inequality can influence family patterns across state lines. So we wanted to know if institutional inequality might influence where married couples moved among those who did move, and if there were differences by whether the couple was a same-sex or different-sex couple. This analysis draws on the Structural Heterosexism Index. It is essentially a composite measure that we've developed of how supportive or restrictive each state's legal and social climate is for same-sex couples. And it included factors like relationship recognition, employment protections, adoption laws, to public attitudes about policies related to sexual minoritized people. And then the map here just shows you we put them into categories. So we have states with low rates of heterosexism, so they would be considered more welcoming to sexual minoritized populations. Then we have the medium, and then we have the high. You can see how that's distributed across the US. And what we found was striking. Same-sex married couples are about 9% more likely than different-sex married couples to move from one low heterosexism state to another. Conversely, they're about 7% less likely to move into a high heterosexism state from a low one. This tells us that inequality isn't only about who gets married or divorced. It's about where people can live safely, raise families, and access institutional rights. It's a vivid example of how inequality is geographic, not abstract. Policy environments can literally redistribute people across the map, concentrating advantage and disadvantage in new ways. And sometimes those inequalities become most visible when systems are under stress, during moments of rupture, when even stable structures are tested. COVID-19 gave us a natural experiment in how families responded when every system was under strain. Our work on national trends showed a clear drop in the refined marriage and divorce rates during the year of the pandemic, but we wanted to look more closely at how the pandemic reshaped marriage and divorce across states. So specifically, we asked how COVID-19 affected marriage and divorce activity, how were those effects shaped by policy responses, viral spread, and economic resilience, and then how much did pre-existing state differences matter? And this diagram here is just illustrating our logic, so you all get a sense of what we were looking at. So to test this, we built that monthly administrative state level panel data set covering March 2019 through December of 2021. Our core data came from the NCFMR Marriage and Divorce Data Compass, which is funded by NIH. And these data are the ones that are going to be made available in 2026. And then we merged those data with demographic baselines from the census, case counts from Johns Hopkins, policy indices from the UCCP database, and then monthly economic indicators from the Philadelphia Fed's Coincident Economic Activity Index. So together, these sources allowed us to account for both the immediate shocks of the pandemic and the underlying structural variation across states. And here I'm showing just the year-over-year plots to demonstrate how far monthly rates deviated from the 2019 baseline, helping us isolate how much of this variation exceeded normal seasonal patterns. And we're running out of time, but it's very clear that marriage and divorce had dropped early on, and there seems to be a little bit of a rebound. Pulling it together, the results highlight 3 key takeaways, and they're highlighted up in the main effects. And really in the full models, what we see is that the economic policies had a depressive effect on marriage, and the case rate had a positive effect, but we're not sure about the causality of that. We're still exploring lag versions of our measures. And then regarding divorce, containment policies did have a negative effect on that, but in the full model, those were accounted for. The final study I'm going to talk about today zooms out to the levels of belief systems, what I call the moral geography of family life. And here we're looking at how 2 major American institutions, religion and politics, interact with behavior, and both are deeply entwined with family life, and both vary dramatically across regions. You recall that first descriptive paper I outlined found that 2 county level indicators were related to high marriage and high divorce. That was evangelical Protestantism adherence and Republican votes. And so here I wanted to go deeper, and I estimated a series of multi-level logistic models predicting whether a county fell in the top quartile of marriage or divorce rates. And we started with a baseline model to capture geographic variation. I added in religion, then politics, demographic controls before combining the religion and politics to test for interactions. And regarding marriage, we found that counties with higher concentrations of Black Protestant and other religious adherents are significantly more likely to have high marriage rates. In contrast, counties with more mainline Protestant or Orthodox adherents tended to have lower marriage rates. And politically, counties with more Democratic voters show slightly lower marriage odds, though this effect weakens once we control for religious composition. And then what's especially interesting is that the interaction effect between Protestant adherents, Black Protestant adherents, and high marriage is stronger in more Republican counties, suggesting that religion's influence on marriage intensifies in conservative and cultural climates. Then divorce, we see the other side of the paradox, where counties with higher shares of evangelical Protestant, Orthodox, and other religious adherents are more likely to fall into the top quartile of divorce rates. But in counties with greater religious homogeneity, where residents tend to share the same affiliation, divorce is less common, suggesting that shared faith can offer stabilizing community support. Politically, we see again that the association between evangelical Protestant concentration and divorce is strongest in Republican counties, where marriage is highly valued, but social safety nets and institutional supports are often weaker. So when we place this in a broader frame, we see how family formation isn't merely personal, it's structured by systems, economic, institutional, and cultural, that distribute opportunity unevenly. Policy matters because it sets the conditions under which families form and endure. Belief matters because it shapes the meanings attached to those choices. And when we trace these patterns together, geography, inequality, and belief, the map of American family life becomes in many ways a map of American policy, politics, and power. So if we bring family back into our models of health, we can see how connection itself becomes a determinant of well-being. Across all these examples, we've seen that family life doesn't unfold in isolation. It's shaped by the systems people live within, economic, institutional, and cultural. And yet when we look to frameworks like here that I've modeled, like the social determinants of health, family is almost invisible. Families aren't just one of many social conditions. They're the mechanism linking social context to individual well-being. The family is quite literally the missing determinant of health. And that's not a new realization. It's one we've been circling for more than a century. 120 years ago, President Theodore Roosevelt called on Congress to collect reliable statistics on marriage and divorce, recognizing that family life was central to the nation's well-being. Today, that call still resonates, but the challenge today isn't just to collect the data, it's to broaden what we see as family and what we mean by health. If diversity sustains ecosystems, might the same be true for families? What if we treated family diversity not as a breakdown, but as an adaptation, a form of social resilience worth studying, supporting, and sustaining? That belief is what drives my own work today, translating these ideas into action. That's the lens I bring to my work in both demography and public health, and it's why I've been asked to be a part of the State of Ohio Adversity and Resilience, or SOAR project, which is a first of its kind multi-generational study that will give us a playbook for understanding the biological, psychological, and social patterns that shape mental health, much like we've already had done for heart disease. My focus in this project is on how families are measured, making sure our instruments capture the full ecology of family life, the structures, relationships, and contexts that sustain well-being across generations. In that sense, we're not just collecting data, we're redefining what counts as health and who counts in our models. This is where demography and public health meet and where our next century of discovery hopefully begins. Thank you.